Welcome everyone to this special Mile End Institute webinar. The Mile End Institute is Queen Mary Centre for Debating Politics, Policy and Public Life, and my name's Dr Lyndsey Jenkins. I'm one of the Deputy Directors at the Centre. We wanted to put on this special webinar to draw on the expertise of some of the learned historians in our school who have particular expertise in the current crisis and the current moment. This is a very distressing and dangerous moment, and those of us who know Ukrainians must feel that even more deeply, and all of us recognise the magnitude of current events. The intention of today's seminar is to discuss this in historical context and the uses and misuses of history. History is featured in President Putin's justification for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the Ukrainians refuse to accept his version of their nation's history, as the world watches on, wondering how that history is being changed. So to introduce our colleagues who can speak to this theme, Dr. James Ellison is reader in international history who specialises on the history of international affairs, focusing on alliance politics in the West. And his books have considered Britain's relations with Western Europe and the United States in the Cold War. He has also written about Anglo-American relations in the post-Cold War period, particularly in relation to the wars in Kosovo and Iraq. Dr. Andy Willimott is senior lecturer in Russian history. He's a historian of modern Russia and the Soviet Union, with particular interest in the formation and popular experience of revolution, radical discourse, and utopian models. And his first book concentrated on the urban communes in the Soviet Union after the revolution and the use that worked with the Bolsheviks. And finally, Dr. Joe Cronin is lecturer in modern German history and specialises in modern German, Jewish and Eastern European history, particularly after the Holocaust. His first book explored the large-scale migration of Jews from the former Soviet Union to Germany between 1990 and 2005. So to explain a little about the format of this session, our speakers will give brief presentations and we will open the floor for discussion. For ease of that discussion, it probably makes most sense if you write your comments and questions in the chat, and we can then invite our speakers to respond. This is very much a session for learning and for discussion rather than presentation, so that we can understand the events in Ukraine both as scholars and as citizens. So do take the opportunity to engage in that debate and to ask questions. So I'm going to begin by handing over to James for the first presentation.
Thanks very much, Lyndsey, and thanks to the Mile End Institute for having us along. As we marvel at the bravery of the Ukrainians in their defiance against Russian aggression, academics and other experts debate intensely the origins, meaning and consequences of the war in Ukraine. And now there are two dominant explanations of its causes. One places responsibility upon Vladimir Putin and the other on the West. Those who blame Putin tend to be specialists on Russian or on Russian-Ukrainian history. We could turn to Stephen Kotkin, the Princeton biographer of Stalin, or Sergei Yelkachik of the University of Victoria in Canada, who's written a book about the 2015 conflict over Ukraine. Both of these experts and others such as Anne Applebaum have suggested that the war is a result of Putin's opposition to democracy in Ukraine on Russia's border and what that represents for the future of Russia, informed by Putin's vision of Russia's past, and that explains the war that we are all watching unfold. For them, Putin's rhetoric about NATO aggression and NATO encirclement as justification for the war is simply that, rhetoric. The war has Russian origins, about Russians' relationships with former Soviet republics and the future of Russia in a world dominated by democracies. Now, there's a contrary view. Experts in the West, many of them former office holders in the United States, are involved in a kind of real-time collective guilt about not seeing the signs, and worse, about contributing to the origins of the war by provoking Russia under Yeltsin and Putin since 1991. This argument's not new. It was made in 1998 by the US diplomat and Sovietologist who foresaw the Cold War back in 1946. George Kennan said that the West's expansion of NATO after the end of the Cold War was a tragic mistake because no one was threatening anyone and because the Russians would react adversely. Now, I'm not a specialist on Russian history or on Putin's regime, and I defer to my colleagues who are, not least Andy. That said, I find it hard to believe that Russian governments since 1991 have not felt provoked by Western strength, and that Putin's worldview and his actions against Ukraine are not in some way a response to global conditions. Now, I know more about the history of the West and the Cold War and beyond, and about NATO, and I find it more convincing to suggest that Cold War legacies and the policies pursued by the West after 1989 help explain Putin's war in Ukraine. Now, ultimately, a full history of the causes of that war will have to include Putin, his personality and regime, Russia's history, Ukraine's history, the history of the West, and of global affairs. It will need to be a history of high politics and mass politics, of leaders and peoples, geopolitics and national politics, economics, ideas, culture, and society. And I list all of those things because that, of course, is the kind of historical explanation that has been the product of generations of Cold War historians who bequeath to us a broad understanding of that conflict in their work. And I'm going to call on that historiography briefly and a bit of my own research to answer two questions now. The first one is, what are the origins of the war in Ukraine? And the second one is, what is the historical significance of the war? So first of all, the origins. What those who argue that NATO has nothing to do with the origins of the war in Ukraine, or those who argue that its cause seems to be only rested in NATO expansion, what they'd seem to do is fail to consider the wider geopolitical backdrop to current events, which does involve NATO as a symbol of the West. Here, I think we can think of two worldviews in conflict, and in doing so, draw on the historiography of the Cold War. The Cold War was defined by antagonistic ideological superpower alliances who pursued incompatible worldviews. And in 1989, one of those worldviews was defeated in its ideological form, of course. It was not defeated, it seems, in its nationalist form. Russian leaders since 1991 have found it impossible to think of Russia as anything other than a great power. The course of international affairs since 1991 has also embittered them in their view of the West. The idea that the West has not dealt fairly with their claims to international great power status. I see roughly three causes of Russian discontent. There's plenty more, but let's stick with those for the moment. The first is the post-Cold War expansion of the Western architecture of institutional structures in Europe, and principally, I mean the EU and NATO here. One of the things we've learned from Cold War historiography is that whilst the Cold War was global and that most of the deaths in the Cold War came in the global South, Europe remained critical to its course and central particularly to the strategic visions in Moscow, Washington, and other capitals. The second cause of Soviet discontent, Russian discontent, is post 9/11 US foreign policy. The Russians have seen in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and the failures of US governments there evidence of both expansionist Western aims and flawed Western policies. The third factor that we need to consider is the recent flux in international affairs, particularly during the Trump presidency. We expect to think that relations between the United States and Russia improved under Trump. But in fact, if we look closely, the dismantling of much of the Cold War architecture and treaty agreements on weapons and forces destabilized relations. It's also clear that in the same period, from the end of the Cold War to the present, we've seen a rise of autocratic visions of world order as a geopolitical backdrop to the events that we're now watching every day. The joint statement issued by China and Russia on the 2nd of February was historic in many ways, not least because of its claim that the entire world needs new leadership, thereby issuing a direct challenge to the Western liberal rules international order that the Americans and their allies have been pursuing. So what I think we see in the broader origins of the current war is the evolution of world events since 1991, particularly the evolving clash between two competing and incompatible worldviews. These are no longer the ideological worldviews up till 1989, although China, of course, is a communist country. They're worldviews about the way democracies and autocracy should work and about great power groupings. I'll just offer some quick thoughts about my second question, which is, what is the historical significance of the war? It's significant in many, many ways, but I'll identify just three. First, this is a war of major geopolitical significance. It's the end of the post-Cold War period. Russian forces in Ukraine, however they fare, are a direct challenge to democracy as an idea and to the West. Secondly, this is a war which will have historic outcomes that Putin did not expect. The first of those is the consolidation and determination of the West. That is seen in the American return to the defense of Europe, and also the Bundestag speech of the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Thirdly, and finally, this is a war which reminds us that history is the product of geopolitics and of leaders, state relations, economic and military might, but also of people affected by those geopolitics. The interplay between global geopolitics and life in Kyiv and other cities, towns, and countryside in Ukraine is that ties between Ukraine and the West have always existed, and difficulties between Ukraine and Russia and the Soviet Union before it have also existed. And that in the generational change in Ukraine, especially since 1991, and particularly since the 2012 European Union-Ukrainian Association Agreement, has seen Ukrainians seek a future which did not comply with Putin's regime and Putin's vision. It's been a struggle between ideas of Western democracy and Russian autocracy, and visions of the past and of the future. And the result at the moment is this terrible war. Thank you, Lyndsey.
Thank you very much, James. And we'll hand straight over to Andy.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you to the Milden End Institute for inviting me here. Thank you, Lyndsey, for introducing us. I'm going to bring up a few talking points. I'm going to start with history and then move into just giving some background to Putin's Russia. And I'll start with history, not just because I'm a historian, but because it's clear that Putin is thinking not just geopolitically, but historically. And I think we need to take serious his historic pronouncements in order to try and understand what's going on. Now, obviously, on the 21st of February, before Russia moved in to Ukraine, Putin gave his rambling speech on Russian-Ukrainian history. This was seen to justify the invasion. It grossly distorted Ukrainian-Russian history, and it effectively said that the Ukrainian nation wasn't formed until the Bolsheviks formed it in 1917. And this was a bit of a shock to many of us, but actually it shouldn't have been, because he said very similar things back in June 2021 in his call-in sessions with the Russian public, where he said that Ukraine and Russia are one. And then in an essay he apparently authored in July 2021, and went on very much to say the same thing. And he seems to be alluding to a Russian imperialist response to Ukrainian nationalism of the 19th century, which broke down the various nations to form a vision of a greater Russia. That is, Russia, as we understand it today, was Great Russia. Then you'd have Belarus, the White Russians, and then you'd have Ukraine, the Little Russians. And this was a way of dismissing their own nationalisms and consuming them within a Russian nationalism. And this is a theory that also said that Ukrainian and Belarusian languages were but dialects of Russian, so which is not true. But I also want to break down a bit more some of that history. So Putin says that Ukraine is Russia. Well, what are the roots of that argument? The roots are that Kievan Rus was formed in the 9th century. This was a center of power for the Slavic peoples and principalities of the time. And both Russia and modern day Ukraine can trace its origins to the foundation of Kievan Rus in modern day Kyiv. Now, Kievan Rus collapsed in the 12th century. And the center of power shifted to Muscovy and eventually obviously becomes Moscow. And the principalities of Muscovy were ultimately united under Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible, in the 1530s. And this is the beginning of what we understand as a more centralized Russian state. Come the mid-17th century, this new Russian state incorporates parts of Ukraine, or modern day Ukraine, especially the eastern parts. So from then, and until recent times, at least some part of Ukraine had belonged to Russia and the Russian Empire. But they also did develop separate nations with their own distinct languages, cultures, and traditions through all of this. And again, like I said, in the 19th century, there was a prominent Ukrainian nationalism that threatened many Russian imperialists. And so let's be clear that Ukraine definitely predated Lenin and the Bolsheviks, which is not what Putin claims. What happened in 1917 was the Bolsheviks merely recognized the nation state of Ukraine and many other nations as part of its federative entity, a part of the USSR as it was meant to function. Each nation within the USSR had its own separate institutions and governments, although ultimately they were under the oversight of the Central Committee and Kremlin rule. This national identity and the supranational identity of the Soviet Union together made what the Soviet Union was. But it was when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 that it broke apart upon those nationalist lines, upon those national lines. And the Ukrainian SSR became the nation state of Ukraine that we know today. And there were many Russian speakers, Russians, some people who would identify as ethnic Russians living in Ukraine at the time these borders were changed. Just as there are many Ukrainians living in Russia and many Kazakhs living in Russia and many Russians living in Kazakhstan, because the Soviet Union was a more fluid entity. And to some extent, just like the Russian Empire, Russians were encouraged to go to the borderlands because they were thought to be more reliable citizens. And this has a consequence to this day, obviously. Now, the other thing that Putin has been saying is that he's obviously there to denazify Ukraine. So let's just be clear on something. There are no Nazis in the government of Ukraine. There are no Nazis administering Ukraine. No one is committing a genocide against ethnic Russians, as Putin has claimed. Moreover, the Ukrainians were involved in the Red Army, obviously, and were a central fighting area when it comes to the Nazi occupation of the Soviet Union. I think what Putin, well, I know what Putin has referred to and is overemphasizing is examples of people such as Stepan Bandera, a Ukrainian nationalist who fought with the Nazis at this point in time, seeking Ukrainian independence, and a figure who was again co-opted by Ukrainian nationalists in the early 2000s. And obviously there's been a lot of talk out of Russia about the Azov Battalion, which formed in 2014 to repel Russian-backed separatist forces in the Donbass region, and its founder was a neo-Nazi. Now, he's no longer part of this battalion. It's estimated still 10% of that battalion are of a far-right persuasion, but let's remember that this is one battalion. It was not officially backed by the state initially, and this was something that's formed in the extremes of wartime conditions. It isn't part of the government of Ukraine, but these points have been exaggerated within Russian propaganda to support Putin's claim. So in reality, this kind of brief history check, current circumstances have very little to do with actual Ukrainian Russian history and more to do with with Putin's interpretations. And whilst we can say perhaps that Ukraine is a young nation in its post-1991 form, it is still a sovereign nation that has been invaded by a foreign force. So let me jump to Putin. So obviously Putin was hand-selected by Boris Yeltsin in 1999 and the oligarchs. And in 2000, he made a move against the oligarchs. He presented himself as the fit, sober, strong individual, the opposite of Boris Yeltsin, often seen as drunk on the diplomatic stage. And his main mission was to restore pride in Russia. And one thing he did in 2003 was ensure the arrest of probably the richest man in the world at that point in time, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who whose personal wealth was about $15 million and was the owner of the Yukos oil and gas enterprise. Now in 2005, he was sentenced to 9 years. And one of the Putin Russian watchers, Bill Brower, has reported on what is rumor and speculation, but that post 2003, one thing that happened is Putin called the oligarchs in, and they said, "What does it take for that not to happen to us?" And he replied with 50%, meaning that all your wealth, or 50% of all your wealth, is mine. You can hold it under my patronage, but it is mine. You know, if that's entirely true, then he's probably the richest man in the world. But you know, the exact truth of it doesn't necessarily matter. It does. There's probably a grain of truth in it. But what it does also show us is that I think there's two power bases here. There's the old traditional oligarchs who hold their money under the patronage of Putin. And then there's the new political elite who have come to the fore under Putin's government and securing governmental positions, and who have themselves amassed huge wealth, but are perhaps the most loyal Putinists of all. And there's perhaps two factions, broadly speaking, to keep in mind with that regard. Now, jumping ahead to give a brief history of Putin's Russia. Obviously, in 2008, with Georgia talking to about the potential of joining NATO, Russia and Putin were not happy, and Russia ultimately enters Georgia in the name of defending Russian-backed self-proclaimed republics of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Jumping to 2011, when the presidential elections and parliamentary elections are being held, tens of thousands of citizens come to the streets in Moscow, Petrograd, and cities across Russia, protesting fraud in those elections. And this continues to 2013 in many ways. This is the time when Pussy Riot was coming to the fore. This was the time when Navalny was coming to the fore, who was obviously recently been sentenced yet again. And what's happening at this point in time is Putin, whose base has been secured on appearing tough to the oligarchs and securing a stable economy, he's now shifting to a more nationalist rhetoric. It's at this point in time in 2012, 2013 that he introduces his anti-gay propaganda laws. It's at this point in time that he becomes more overtly aligned with the Orthodox Church. It's at this point in time when the celebration of Victory Day from the Second World War, again, is escalated. And then obviously with the change in Ukraine with Viktor Yanukovych in 2014 and the Euromaidan protests, we see Putin decide to action and annex Crimea, and to again back Russian separatists in the Donbass region. And the background to all of this is also, well, not the background, but the further context to this is Syria. Obviously, Russia enters Syria or bombs Syria in support of Assad in 2015. And this is a pattern that we should be alive to, because it is continued up until this invasion in Ukraine. Let's not forget that the FSB, the Russian FSB, and Russian support was given to Belarus to crush protests there in 2021, and then just earlier this year, Russian forces paramilitary forces were sent into Kazakhstan to stop protests there, to secure the alliances that had been established with the regime in those areas. Now, all the time back at home in Russia, there's been a crackdown on civil liberties, especially from 2014. One now requires permits to protest, and you can only legally protest in single pickets. Media has been restricted. Most Russians, certainly those over 40, get their media and their news through the television, and the only alternative sources have been through radio and through social media and some very brave Russian outlets who have now since been shut down. And so it is incredibly hard for Russians to protest this war. And I know there will be many Ukrainians who are quite rightly frustrated with that. And I know that there are some in the West that view what we see as silence among many Russians as consent towards Putin's actions. But I just want to pause and urge some caution here, because silence is itself a form of act, a political act in Russia. There were, until very recently, no pro-war protests in Russia. And obviously we had on the 18th of March, the big pro-war rally in Luzhniki Stadium in Moscow, in which reportedly many state workers were bussed in and offered incentives to attend this rally. Not to say that there aren't genuine supporters, but the point is that the initial lukewarm reaction of many and the hostility of many others is telling that this hasn't gone to plan and that this isn't resonating with the Russian public in the way that perhaps the annexation of Crimea did. For many Russians, Crimea is Russian. It was only given to Ukraine in 1954 by Nikita Khrushchev, and so Putin's message resonated on Crimea in a way that I'm not sure it quite does with Ukraine. And then obviously more recently we've seen celebrities and Russian artists and rappers come out against the war. We saw in the first days of the war, we saw the Tretyakov Gallery, famous art gallery, and a state institution post Vershnyagin's Apotheosis of War, a painting against, it was painted in 1871, very much against Russian imperial expansion into Central Asia. They were sending a message. And then obviously Maria Ovsyannikova on the 14th of March walked on to the set of Channel 1 News with her anti-war banner in an incredibly brave act that will undoubtedly see her serve time. So ultimately what we see here from the Russian perspective is two fronts. We see the war front in Ukraine, which is going badly in military terms, and we see a home front that's been shaped by 10 years of civil liberty repression, but a home front that I think we don't quite know how it will react in the coming years. And I'll end on that point.
I don't know where Lyndsey is.
It looks like Lyndsey's dropped out, I think. We'll try and get her back, but Joe, why don't you start your presentation?
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, let me just see if I can share my screen. Can you see this?
We can indeed, yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. So thank you very much for the invitation. So just to pick up on a point Andy just made, like a lot of people, and I'm a historian of Germany, I was struck by Vladimir Putin's use of the term denazification to describe one of the key objectives of the so-called special operation in Ukraine, both before and indeed since the invasion. I'm especially struck by the terminology, I suppose, because in the West, it's increasingly Putin and Putin's regime that is being compared to Hitler and the Nazis. So why does Putin single out that term denazification, the denazification of Ukraine, as a justification for the invasion? And I have two possible answers. One stems from the Soviet Union's occupation of the eastern part of Germany in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. That occupation lasted from 1945 to 1949. And the other has to do with Putin's experiences with Germany, personal experiences with Germany, specifically East Germany in the late 1980s as a KGB officer stationed in the city of Dresden. I'm going to look at each of these briefly now. Okay, so in the closing months of the Second World War, as you can see on this map here, so sort of early months of 1945, the Soviet Red Army swept through Eastern Europe, in many cases driving out the German occupying forces before reaching Germany and Berlin in late April. The Soviet Red Army, as such, liberated Berlin, although it probably didn't feel like much of a liberation to the city's inhabitants, who in many cases were treated with extreme brutality by the Soviet forces, particularly German women. To cut a long story short, when Germany was officially occupied by the four allies, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union was allocated Germany's eastern zone. Let me just show you here, the pink zone in the east, which in the middle of it, as you can see, is Berlin. As predominantly for logistical reasons, it is closest to the Soviet Union. It's the direction in which the Soviet army had already entered Germany. At the peace conference in Yalta, the Yalta Peace Conference in the summer of 1945, the four allies had agreed to implement a program of denazification in occupied Germany. The only problem was that each ally had its own idea of what denazification meant. So while the Americans and the British were largely content to distribute a questionnaire to all adult residents of their zones, which basically enabled a lot of people, former Nazis, to evade justice, the Soviets implemented a much deeper and more thoroughgoing purge of their zone's political, judicial, and administrative elites to ensure that not a single, at least their intention, not a single former Nazi was left in a position of power. And now this is all very laudable, you might think, but this effective, if brutal form of denazification hid an ulterior motive. Namely, it enabled the Soviets to install their own personnel in the vacant positions, meaning that the eventual takeover, I mean, maybe not strictly speaking a takeover, the setting up of a Soviet allied satellite state that became the German Democratic Republic in 1949 was facilitated, was made a lot easier by this purge of former Nazis in the Soviet zone. Now, if you take out the Nazis, as Andy rightly pointed out, you have a scenario that you might agree sounds rather familiar to the present day situation in Ukraine. So my contention here is that the term denazification has become, in Russian political culture, or at least amongst, certainly with Putin and amongst his supporters and in his regime, denazification has become a kind of shorthand justification for imposing a friendly government by force and thereby extending one's geostrategic sphere of influence. But just as a final point, some of you will know that Putin is actually a proficient German speaker, and this comes from his time as a KGB officer when he was stationed in the East German city of Dresden from 1985 to 1990. As one of the Soviet Union satellite states in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union was allowed to have a large military presence in East Germany, and indeed did so for the duration of the state's existence up until 1990. And we can see here Putin's Stasi ID card, not his KGB ID card. The KGB and the Stasi were stationed very close to each other in Dresden, and the KGB officers needed to use the facilities in the Stasi headquarters, hence why Putin also had a Stasi ID. Now, in the spring of 1989, a people's movement calling for the overthrow of the SED regime, the regime governing East Germany, had been brewing. And on the 5th of April, 1989. Protesting crowds in Dresden stormed the local headquarters of the Stasi, the East German secret police, before going across the street to assail the local branch of the KGB. And it's there that the crowds are faced down by this young officer called Vladimir Putin. And Putin apparently to this day is still scarred by making a phone call to Moscow, asking them to send in a few tanks to crush the demonstration, and being told in response, Moscow is silent. And it's shortly after this incident that the young Putin packs his bags and heads back to Russia to start a career in St. Petersburg municipal politics. And I suppose, as a concluding note, one could say that the rest is history, but in fact, perhaps the rest is the present day reality that we are witnessing in Ukraine. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much for those really thoughtful and wide-ranging points. I wonder if, while there's already been quite a number of questions coming in, James, you've already very kindly answered Column's questions on China and on Ukrainian application for membership, but actually I think you've only directed the answers to the panelists. So I wonder if you might speak to the answers that you were providing in those, the answers to those questions.
Sure, Lyndsey, thank you. I didn't realize I'd done that. My apologies. So Colin asked if the situation that we're facing will be very different depending on the response of China. And I was just saying that that's absolutely right. And Chinese caution at the moment may be one of the miscalculations of Putin, along with his military misunderstandings and his miscalculation about the resilience of the Ukrainians. It was probably expected that the Chinese would swing behind the Russians. They've given them tacit support in the United Nations, but as yet they haven't fully supported the Russians. And that's probably because the Chinese, like the Russians, have been surprised at the strength and consolidation of the economic response of the West. Because the Chinese are, of course, intimately involved in global economic affairs and couldn't survive a mass form of sanctions as currently directed against the Russians. The second question that Colin asked, let me just call it up for us now, was about how both IR realists and some Anglo-American left partly blame NATO expansionism in the 1990s, 2000s for stoking Russia. Does the clear reluctance of NATO members to let Ukraine join in the 2010s throw more doubt on that? In other words, is this nothing more than a convenient excuse for Putin? I think he's right to ask that question. And the truth is that the cohesion of the West at the moment is unusual and unexpected, and obviously the product of a response to the bravery of the Ukrainians and the threat to the democratic West presented by the Russians. But the cohesion is short-lived in the sense that it's new. And there have been some differences already amongst the NATO member states. And I think the differences that we saw before about how to think about the future of NATO will be resurgent, changed, and different as things are recalibrated after the war.
Thank you very much. And we've had two questions about, one about kind of media narratives, which I think was asked before you began your discussion, James, but then subsequently we have another question on the BBC World Service. And so I do wonder if it's worth, as a panel, you offering your specific reflections on the role of the media and of journalism and on the kind of the use of information and propaganda in the war. If any of you would like to speak to that.
Andy, why don't you have a go?
Do you want me to go first, James? I mean, I suspect you can carry on. Well, yeah, I mean, to quote James, something he said before, you know, in many ways, this is the first social media war. So we're in many ways, we're being bombarded with direct emotional responses from the war. It doesn't necessarily mean we're getting more accurate information, but we're certainly having to deal with a lot of information. From again, I guess the thing that I can speak to best here is information out of Russia. And obviously the further crackdown on free media in Russia has been dramatic. You know, the independent radio stations such as Echo Moskvy were taken off the air very swiftly. A very reputable Russian-based independent news agency known as Meduza has fled, and many of its leading editors fled across the Finnish border. Obviously, the latest news is that Finland are going to stop running trains to St. Petersburg. So that potential exit strategy for liberal Russians is perhaps now gone. But yeah, there's been a huge crackdown, and what's coming out of Russia is from the kind of Western journalists. We've had that odd moment where when Russia introduced this new draconian law that acknowledging the war, talking about war as opposed to the special operation, can land you with a 15-year jail sentence. We had this moment where many, BBC journalists and etc. and others fled the country, and some have gone back, and some are now they've worked out how to toe the line of just not talking about the war, talking about the so-called special operation, and they are getting information to us out of Russia. In terms of what's coming out of Ukraine, then obviously we've got some incredibly brave journalists there providing information, and also somewhat more disturbingly, and something that worries me, a lot of more independent journalists and freelancers that are reporting through Twitter and getting picked up by various media channels. And they're doing some very brave things, but actually that has been one thing that's made me very uncomfortable, because they're not on a wage necessarily. They're being paid for the stories that they are garnering piecemeal, if you will. Sorry, a slightly rambling answer, but I don't know if James or Joe can speak to that any further.
Joe, would you like to say something?
No, I can't add anything to what Andy said.
In which case, I'll extol the virtues of a former Queen Mary School of History undergraduate and then postgraduate, Alban Webb, who wrote a book called London Calling, which talked about the history of the World Service in the Cold War, and particularly its role in spreading Western perspectives on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and the contribution that the World Service made, particularly in Hungary. And it's absolutely right to note that the World Service has been exceptionally prominent, and so too is the Voice of America. Both of these radio broadcasting platforms are part of the Western struggle to make sure the people of Ukraine do not feel isolated, and also to keep pressing democracy on the airwaves. It's as simple as that.
Thank you. Just to say, I did lose connection for a moment earlier, and so I think I may have missed one or two, and so I'll do my best to keep as many coming as I can. Can I ask a question from earlier on the Crimea has come up already in the discussion, and someone's asking about the kind of historical context of that transfer from Russia to Ukraine back in the 50s. Might any of you be able to speak to that, please? Andy, perhaps.
Yeah, well, it's to be honest, it's not something I have deep knowledge on, but effectively what happened in obviously 1954 is it's seen as a gift to Ukraine, and it's this is obviously in the context of a post-war context, and it's also to do with the administration of the broader region. Although to be honest, the deep historic roots and discussions on it is something that I'm not fully up to date with. It's not an area of expertise I have. James, have you got a deeper knowledge on that?
Only that it was part of Khrushchev's attempt to improve relations with the government of Ukraine in the mid-50s after Stalin's death.
Yeah, and the point being that Khrushchev himself, of Ukrainian extraction, was the person to do this. I mean, that does bring up a slight tangent thought here, insofar as one of the complicating factors here, and this isn't in any way meant to deny Ukrainian trauma, which I think is a true thing. But there is that uncomfortable truth about what the Soviet Union was. And there was a period whereby it was ruled over by someone of Ukrainian extraction longer than it was ever ruled over by a Russian. Now that could be misused. That information could be misused. So I say that with all due caution. But one thing to perhaps take from that is that I think Putin does also tap into something else where Russians also feel like the victims of the Soviet Union. Russians, before the Soviet Union, Russians were held in serfdom. During the Soviet Union, Russians were the victims of the KGB. Russians had no right to property or a personal life. Everything that was overseen. And I think Putin taps into that Russian grievance when he comes to celebrate Russia as well. Sorry, that's a slight tangent, but there's something that Putin is doing with that grievance, Russian grievance, that explains some of what's going on.
Very much so. And to kind of come much more recently, Richard's asking about Ukraine's decision to give up its nuclear weapons in the mid-1990s. Some scholars at the time arguing that this was a mistake and opened up Ukraine to Russian aggression. But how controversial was this decision within Ukraine, and were the guarantees from other nuclear states at that time enough? Do any of you feel like you could speak to that?
Do you want me to start on that, James, or Joe? Well, so obviously, in hindsight, it does seem like a hugely problematic entity. Basically, what's happened in the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, what happens is Ukraine and Kazakhstan and Belarus agree to give up the nuclear armaments on their territory. And effectively what's happening here is that the center of power is still Washington and Moscow. So under huge pressure from America and Moscow, they agreed to do this so that the nuclear powers remain America and Russia in that regard. And it's, I guess, in the context of the chaos of the 90s, it makes sense to limit the amount of, or the number of nuclear powers in the world. So that makes some sense. But the whole point and the grievance of Ukrainians to this day, and obviously Zelensky has brought this up on numerous occasions, was that those countries did that, Ukraine did that, under the agreement that they would be protected. But that's obviously not happened.
Joe, if I might come to you with a question specifically on Rebecca has offered a reflection on the liberation and denazification, so the claim to be fighting fascism, which she says is particularly striking given Putin's imperialistic vision. She's suggesting that fascism and imperialism, in this sense, being both forms of oppression and two sides of the same coin. I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, it's the term fascism has quite a deep lineage in Russia, in the former Soviet Union, more generally, going back, to the 1920s, with fascism being the sort of the main enemy of the Soviet Union. And I think it almost becomes a sort of semantic bogeyman in a way, and the same with imperialism, of course. In socialist thought, imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, according to Lenin, and so forth. So using those terms against enemies is an effective rhetorical strategy, even if it has no basis in reality, even if as the person who raised the question said, it is probably more accurately applied to Putin's Russia at the present time. But I don't want to say too much, because I'm not an expert in Russia, and I think maybe Andy can comment further on that. But I could say something a bit later about the religion question as well, that has been raised.
do you want me to pick up on any of that? I think Joe. I mean, Joe, you sell yourself short. I think. I mean, Joe, you're quite right. There's a longer lineage of what fascism is. And again, I've seen Soviet newspapers from 26, 27, where they're talking about the fascist threat, and it's not something that's being an enemy that's created in the 30s. Is well understood much before that. And yes, that links back to Lenin's great contribution to Marxist theory, if we look at it in that way, and that is to view imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. In terms of the complicated legacies thereafter, is that obviously you have Russia, this regional power and imperial power under the Tsars, and you have this complex relation or formation of what is it after 1917. The Soviet Union has been referred to as the Soviet Empire, an evil empire. Also, it did offer some self-determination, especially in the early years after 1917, and has been referred to as the affirmative action empire because it promoted local customs, cultures, and languages in those countries. And that was viewed, and it might have become something quite perverse thereafter, but in those early years, it promoted this. It was an anti-imperialist development to say that we are all equal. But it was still nonetheless based along a slightly racialized understanding whereby those lesser countries need to be elevated so that they can reach the level of a sophisticated Moscow. And in some ways, that kind of cultural trope of the sophistication, the civilizational center in Moscow is still motivating Putin to this day.
Thank you. I'm really conscious of time, so I'm going to try and squeeze in as many kind of further questions as I can. We've had two questions on the relationship between Zelensky and the Ukrainian government and its relationship with Russia and how it tried to navigate that particular relationship. Would any of you feel able to speak to that?
I don't have any particular expertise in that question, I'm afraid, Lyndsey. I think we will probably just know what we know from the press.
In that case, I'll turn back to the question on religion and the role that's been played in kind of and how that's been instrumentalized. Joseph, you said you were able to speak to that.
Yeah, so it's probably not the main point on this question, but it is an interesting, I would say, complicating factor that Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is Jewish. And so Putin's attempt to besmirch his government as being Nazi has a very odd kind of historical flavor to it. Zelensky himself, in the past few days, has been criticized by making comparisons between the war in Ukraine and the Holocaust. He appealed to the Israeli government for support, again making the comparison of genocide and saying that they should basically they should help for that reason, and also using his own Jewish identity. But as some commentators have pointed out, a Jewish identity of a citizen of a former Soviet state is very different to the Jewish identity of somebody in the West or in Israel. And the understanding of the Holocaust is much more closely rooted to the history of the Second World War and seen as almost like a kind of aspect of the war rather than a sort of separate genocide. And that's because of how the Holocaust was taught about, or really not taught about, in the states of the former Soviet Union, that this was a big collective struggle, the Great Patriotic War. All Soviet citizens were victims. Yes, there was something happened with Jews, but this was part of a bigger narrative. And so, without wanting to sort of generalize, Jews in the former Soviet Union tend to have this idea of not being victims of the Holocaust, but of being victors over Nazism. And of being maybe victims of Nazi fascist aggression in a more general sense. So I think that's how we understand Zelensky's Jewish identity in this context.
Thank you very much. I'm really conscious of time, and and how many questions we've had that we've not had a chance to get to. There are kind of two overarching questions which I thought might be a good place to end the discussion on. One is around Britain's role in this particular context, in this particular conflict, I beg your pardon. And it's something that you started to address, James, directly in response to Justin's question around the way that Johnson is, the role that Johnson appears to be playing, especially vis-a-vis Macron and Biden. And the other is around kind of likely outcomes and scenarios. Both of those are tremendously enormous questions, but I wonder if you might give us your best and briefest reflections on those.
I'll have a quick go on the British one. I'm sure Andy and Joe could talk about the other one as well. Our current Prime Minister in this country, like many Prime Ministers, likes to think that he leads in international affairs. And of course, it's principally important for a domestic audience that he presents himself as such. Otherwise, global Britain doesn't make a lot of sense. But it's quite apparent that he is playing a role, his country is playing a role alongside other European powers, probably of its stature. That's not to undermine the military cooperation that the British have given to the Ukrainians by any means, or the non-governmental cooperation that's obviously existed. But it is to say that the British are playing a medium-sized power role alongside other powers. And right now, as a result of Britain's withdrawal from the European Union, it's no longer central. And it's apparent that Olaf Scholz's decision to raise Germany's defense spending up to 2% or more and to concentrate on the development of the Bundeswehr is the most significant European development. And that, alongside Macron's very traditional French and Russian negotiating position, means that the Prime Minister seems somewhat marginalized. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Yeah, just to chip in, building out of that and speculating some more, and we're all speculating. We can't do anything else about where this will go. I've been looking for positives, and it's incredibly hard to do that. And one positive might be that perhaps this will finally put an end to the fashion of the kind of populist leader, which has afflicted Western countries as well. You know, it no longer looks quite so innocent to play the populist card, perhaps in light of what's going on here. But more generally, in terms of endings, I mean, the last time I had a discussion about this, I was incredibly pessimistic, and the overwhelming force of the Russian military thought would mean an inevitable collapse of Ukraine very swiftly. Now, I don't necessarily buy into the argument that Russia is being pushed back entirely. I think we're seeing a less successful Russian military invasion than we expected. But that weakness is obviously then going back and afflicting Putin directly. And what that does, that might make Putin more dangerous. I don't know. It is likely, and it's hard to get. We don't have much apart from presumably some intel that will never be given about what this is doing on the inside of the Kremlin. But they are reading between the lines. It looks like there are disgruntled figures within Putin's inner faction, and we can only hope that they step in and do something. But that won't result in a nice, fluffy liberal democracy coming to the fore in Russia in the next few years. But it might end the horror that we're living through right now.
Just a quick historical analogies for a moment, Lyndsey, if we have time. And then a reflection on the current situation, just simply to build on what Andy's saying. It's a different circumstance, but in 1979, the Soviets rolled into Afghanistan with that quick expectation of victory. What they found themselves facing was an insurgency which led to a 10-year war. Now, the circumstances are different, not least because of the Western response. And also the situation within Russia is not entirely comparable with that inside the Soviet Union at the time. But as Andy said, we can't bet on there being a fluffy liberal democracy in Russia. From what I've read, and Andy know more than me really, inside Russia under Putin, there are two groups. There's the oligarchs and the very bright money managers who've managed to develop quite a strong economy with low inflation and high amounts of money in the bank to allow Russia to do what it's doing. But then there are the military, and the military, who of course Putin comes from, is much more hawkish and unlikely to back down. So it's hard to guess what the struggle will produce in Russia right now. And it's also hard to guess what the price for Putin will be in seeking a solution in Ukraine. Will it be simply an annexation of Donetsk and Donbass? Will it be a military guarantee, a neutralized zone, a vassal state, or a government with Zelensky or not with Zelensky, which simply plays its dues to Moscow? It's hard to see right now.
Joe, would you like to add anything?
No, I mean, the one thing that we didn't talk much about is sort of perspectives of countries outside of the West. We mentioned China briefly, but I think there's a very interesting, in the sense that the perspectives in the global South, in East Asia are rather different to what we've been discussing today. Obviously, we don't have time to talk about them now, but it's interesting to consider, when the conflict does finally end, the implications of that on the sort of geostrategic order of the world. But I won't say any more now.
And there's been really interesting questions being raised, for example, around the role of Iran and analogies with Hong Kong. And I do apologize to everyone that we've not been able to address all of your questions. I think it's really evident from the quality of discussion that we could continue this discussion for at least another hour, but I'm very conscious of our panelists' time and how much we've already been grilling them. So I just want to thank very much Dr. James Ellison, Dr. Andy Willimott, and Dr. Joe Cronin for giving up their time and for being part of this special MEI webinar. I'd also like to thank Tom Chidwick, who's been working behind the scenes to keep this going, and then to thank all of you very much for coming and for listening so attentively, and for all of your really thought-provoking and stimulating questions. And we look forward to seeing you all at future MEI events. Thank you very much.